Hey everybody, Sean McGinnis and Kevin Van Ord here, and like a lot of you folks, we spent the weekend catching up on the Destiny Alpha on PlayStation 4. Kevin, what were your initial impressions after playing it?
Well, actually, I had a really good time.
Yeah.
I do have my quibbles, and
Sure.
I'm sure we'll be getting into those in a few moments. But overall, I really liked it. I think the shooting model is really solid. It's interesting because I see a lot of people drawing parallels to Borderlands, but actually, I have to say I like Destiny's tone a lot better than I like Borderlands, and I like the shooting model itself a lot more than I like Borderlands. So overall, I had a really good time.
Yeah, I mean, the Borderlands comparison is something that a lot of people are making, but to me, like, what appeals to me about Destiny is that it's so much broader in scope. You have those RPG mechanics like you have in Borderlands, but, like, just the makeup of the world is so gorgeous. And then you add in, like, the social elements, running into other players out in the wild, and just, like, the way those weapons feel. Like, Borderlands has 8 billion different permutations of their guns, but I've never been a huge fan of any of them.
Right.
But the weapons in Destiny feel really good, don't they?
Yeah, they feel super good. And I mean, I have to say, going into it, I sort of expected the shooting to feel more or less like Halo, and that's not really the case at all. These weapons feel very different to me from any of Halo's weapons.
So with that in mind, what was your take on the Strike mission? Because the Alpha is a pretty narrow sliver of content. You have that initial story mission, you have that middle mission where you're just kind of exploring out there, doing this big handful of quests, but then you have the third one, which is really what you're working your way up to. It's kind of interesting. It's like a multi-tiered kind of MMO raid almost.
Yeah, so you have the first stretch, which is just you and your two teammates going through the more or less larger area as you make your way to a facility and go into an interior. And it ends with this bit. So you have this little floating computer thing called the Ghost.
Yeah.
And it has the voice of a Lannister.
Pretty complex. I'll need time.
And it's super interesting the way the first part of it sort of ends, because as it hacks into this computer, you and your teammates have to fend off this overwhelming wave of enemies, and it's not just one wave, it's 3 waves of increasingly overwhelming enemies, one of which is this wizard that just takes so many bullets to bring down, and it's sort of relentless. It surprised me because I wasn't really struck by the game being challenging anywhere else, and then suddenly it was a great challenge to have to overcome even just the first part of this, let alone the second 2 bits that come after, both of which are essentially boss fights.
Yeah. This was the part at which the game really gets serious, and you and your fire team have to behave as a group. Because if you're all just running around willy-nilly, you're gonna get yourselves killed so fast, and you always need to have that one guy who's still alive and able to revive people, or stay alive long enough for that spawn counter to tick all the way down, and you get to jump back in automatically.
One nice thing, though, is that revival is very quick. So one thing that is sort of a pet peeve of mine in other shooters that do have revival mechanics is that you have to stand there for a really long time to get dudes off the ground. In this case, you go over, you just hold the button for a few seconds, and you're up and at 'em. No worse for the wear at all. So it's nice and snappy, so reviving other players doesn't feel like a chore like it does in a lot of other games.
So you like that first sequence of the Strike mission. I don't think either one of us really like the second sequence all that much, which is the big Devil Walker, which is kind of like a giant armored spider.
So I've done the Strike mission, I guess, 3 times now, and it strikes me as though it's just a bullet sponge. There is a way of shooting out its legs and getting it to open and shooting its weak spot, but every time I've played it, it seems to be the more common tactic just to fill it with bullets until it dies.
Yeah, and it's weird because it's not a particularly frustrating encounter. It's just really long because this thing lasts forever, and at least in my experience, you just kind of like turtle yourself up in some little corner of the level. You pop out, you fire for a while, you drain all the ammo that you have, wait for those other guys to respawn so that you can kill them, grab more ammo, and then you just keep turtling up and trying to shoot the Devil Walker for the 10 minutes it takes to kill them.
Yeah, it's really strange in the bullet sponge kind of way. And actually, if there's one gameplay issue I have with the Destiny Alpha as a whole, it was that sense of things being more bullet sponge than they were actually a real challenge. It wasn't so much I felt like I was having to stay on my toes as much as I just had to stay focused and had to just keep at it.
And the Devil Walker is interesting because elsewhere in the alpha, that particular enemy is actually used in a public event where he actually comes down, and it's an opportunity for a bunch of players to kind of like just come together out of the blue and team up and take him on. And there, when you have a bunch more players, it's actually a much more interesting fight because you get more of a group sense. But in this strike mission, when it's just 3 of you, it takes so much longer to kill them.
It really does. And then, of course, that leads into the third leg of the fight, which is the one against Sepix Prime. Did I get it right? Something
Sepix
like
Prime,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. So this is actually more interesting than the Devil Walker, at least, because you've got this giant orb that sort of shoots lasers out of it. Plus, you're being, swarmed by hordes of normal enemies coming after you. Although after a while, they get pretty tough, too. You've got a couple of those shielded enemies in particular that can just take seemingly forever to bring down. Again, it's a lot about the bullet sponge. And but the orb's really interesting because it'll teleport into different places and move around. And suddenly I'll be standing there trying to whittle down all the regular guys, and suddenly it teleports and it's right on top of me and I gotta move, and what am I gonna do? Oh my god! So yeah, I like that bit of the fight. There were times where I really just felt suddenly overwhelmed and I had to run and get my breath and try to tackle it from a different angle.
Yeah, I really like the Sepix Prime battle a lot more than the Devil Walker one because, like you said, it was just more dynamic. There was more movement. It wasn't just you popping out and shooting it. It didn't feel like a war of attrition like the Devil Walker. Like there were actual tactics and teamwork elements at play, which is what I liked about it. Plus, you end that and you gain some levels there and you get some loot, which is nice because that leads us into the third point about Destiny, which is multiplayer. All that loot that you capture in the campaign, you actually get to use that in multiplayer, which is kind of one of the interesting things about Destiny.
If there's one other thing that I think doesn't quite work to Destiny's benefit at this stage anyway, is the voice acting and the writing. So for example, there's one place where you utter the line, "I have a bad feeling about this," during the first story mission, and my eyes just
Wait,
roll.
you utter that or Peter Dinklage?
I think Peter Dinklage utters it, and of course he's the voice of your ghost, and so that bit of dialogue right there is so cliched at this point that it's hard not to notice it, and most of the dialogue continues. There's the moment where he's hacking into the computer, and then at one point he says, "Well, I'll try to go faster. Why were you not going fast enough to begin with?" It's one of those things. It's like it's relying so much on those science fiction cliches that I'm a tad worried, especially because of Peter Dinklage's very sleepy voiceover.
But just so you know, there's more Fallen and Hive on the way.
I totally see where you're coming from, but it doesn't bother me quite that much because in the broader scope of things, like that world has so much personality.
Oh my gosh, doesn't it? It's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I think I spent half my time just taking screenshots and uploading them through the PS4 sharing system.
And then dying.
And then dying.
Yes.
But yeah, like it's so gorgeous. That's kind of where you see the budget of that game. It's just like,
oh god,
holy crap, it looks amazing. Well, I mean, it sounds like we both really enjoyed the Destiny Alpha. Personally, I'm interested to see how much progression there is, like whether you keep finding really cool loot at like level 10, level 20, level 30. Like, can it maintain that surprise and delight? Because I feel like that's gonna be where a lot of the strength of the game lies, is finding that really cool shit and then showing it off in multiplayer, which I suspect is kind of going to be the end game component of Destiny once you've done all that story stuff, right?
Right, and then the addition of subclasses and things like that. I really want to see how different I can be, like how unique I can feel, especially as an MMO player. Now, Destiny's not an MMO, but it still has some of those elements.
Sure, yeah, it hits those beats.
Right, and so I'm really anxious to see, like, when all is said and done, how different, how unique am I going to be? I mean, I think the character creation itself made me feel pretty different from all the other people I ran into back in Tower. So
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
we'll see.
Well, there you have it, guys. That's our take on the Destiny Alpha. Make sure to stay tuned to GameSpot.com for even more Destiny coverage coming your way over the next few months.